Tonight, we're going to explore the Apollo 17 transcripts that the United States government kept classified for over 50 years, and what the astronauts reported seeing out the windows of their spacecraft on the way to the moon. You clicked on the right video. This morning, May the 8th, 2026, the Trump administration released the first batch of declassified UAP files to the public. No security clearance required. 160 documents, images, and videos from across the entire United States government, all in one place. Among those files were 3 documents about Apollo 17. A photograph taken near the lunar surface showing 3 points of light that have never been formally explained. A transcript of real-time crew communications with mission control, covering multiple sighting events across the mission, and a post-mission crew debriefing dated January 4th, 1973, stamped at the top and bottom of every single page with one word: confidential. Now, here is what makes this story different from anything else you will hear tonight. The government's own description of every file in this release is that they are unresolved cases. That is the official term. Not confirmed, not explained, unresolved. Meaning that after 53 years, after all the classified handling, after everything, no definitive determination has ever been made about the nature of what these men saw. But here is what those men actually said. Gene Cernan was the commander of Apollo 17. A naval aviator, a test pilot, one of only 12 human beings to walk on the surface of the moon. 2 days into the mission, somewhere in the dark between the Earth and the moon, he looked out the hatch window of the spacecraft and radioed Houston. He was precise. He gave them a positional fix. He described a specific double flash pattern with rhythmic timing. He asked mission control to track it through the spacecraft optics. And then he said this: "I don't know whether that does you any good, but there is something out there." That is a direct quote from the declassified transcript. His words, from December 1972, filed away behind a classification stamp the following month, and released to the public for the first time this morning. So settle in, get comfortable, let the room go quiet around you, because over the next few hours, we are going to read these transcripts together, word for word, the way they were actually recorded. We are going to hear what 3 of the most highly trained observers ever sent into space reported seeing in their own language, in real time, talking to mission control. We are going to look at what explanations existed, which ones held up, and which ones did not. And we are going to sit with the question that the government itself has not been able to answer. Not yet. To understand what those 3 men saw, you have to understand who they were and what it took to put them there. December 7th, 1972. Kennedy Space Center, Florida. It is 12:33 in the morning, local time, which makes it the first nighttime Saturn V launch in the history of the Apollo program. The reason for the delay was a technical hold that pushed the launch window past midnight. And because of that, the people who had gathered on the beaches and the roadsides and the rooftops within 30 miles of the launch pad got something nobody had planned for. When the engines ignited, when 5 Saturn V's first stage engines produced 34 million newtons of thrust and lifted 7 million pounds of spacecraft, fuel, and human beings off the ground, the entire Florida coastline lit up like noon. Witnesses 40 miles away could read a newspaper by the light. People who had driven out expecting to watch a scheduled daytime launch instead watched the sky turn white at midnight, and they stood there in the dark and the warm December air with their mouths open. Inside the command module, the 3 men being carried off the planet felt the thing they always described as more physical than anything else. Not noise, not fire. Vibration, the Saturn V, shook in a way that got inside your chest and rattled things you did not know could be rattled. Gene Cernan, the commander, had felt it before. He had ridden a Titan II rocket to orbit during Gemini 9 in 1966. He had ridden a Saturn V forward to the moon and back during Apollo 10 in 1969. But he said later that it never got normal. You never got used to it. You just learned to function through it. Ron Evans, in the center couch, was making his first spaceflight. Evans had been waiting for this moment for 6 years. He was selected as an astronaut in 1966, the same group as Cernan, and had spent the intervening time training, supporting other missions from the ground, and watching colleagues fly while he waited. He was a naval aviator, a combat veteran of Vietnam, and by all accounts one of the steadiest human beings in the astronaut corps. He was not a man given to nerves, but people who were in the room before launch said that when he walked out to the suit-up van that morning, something in the way he moved was different. Not anxiety, more like a person who's been waiting so long that the moment it finally arrives feels unreal. Harrison Schmitt, the Lunar Module Pilot, was different from both of them in one fundamental way. He was not a test pilot, he was a geologist. He had a doctorate in geology from Harvard, had done field work in Norway and in the American Southwest, and had been selected by NASA in 1965 as part of the first group of scientist astronauts, a deliberate attempt to put actual researchers on the moon instead of just aviators. The test pilots in the astronaut corps had not always been welcoming to the scientist astronauts, and Schmitt had worked hard to earn his place. He went through flight training, logged jet time, made himself useful wherever he could. And when the final Apollo landing missions were being assigned, NASA made a decision that was not universally popular inside the program. They bumped the backup crew's planned Lunar Module Pilot and put Schmitt in instead, because this was the last mission, the last chance to put a trained scientist on the surface of the moon, and they were not going to waste it. The official crew designation was CDR Cernan, CMP Evans, LMP Schmitt. In the transcripts that were released this morning, they are referred to that way throughout: CDR, CMP, LMP. 3 initials standing in for 3 human beings doing something that no human being has done since, and that no human being is currently scheduled to do again. Apollo 17 was the last. It was always going to be the last. The program had been cut. The final 3 missions, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, had been cancelled in 1970 due to budget pressures and a public that had, to NASA's bewilderment, grown somewhat accustomed to the idea of people walking on the moon. The first time, in 1969, it was the most watched broadcast in television history. By Apollo 17, the networks were pulling back their coverage. There were people who thought it was fine to stop going. There were people inside NASA who thought it was a catastrophic mistake. But the decision was made, and Cernan, Evans, and Schmitt knew when they strapped in that night that they were the last. Cernan made sure everyone understood what that meant. In the weeks before the launch, he gave interviews where he was direct about it. He was not going to treat this like a routine mission. He was going to treat it like the last opportunity. He intended to squeeze everything out of it that a human being could. The mission profile was aggressive even by Apollo standards. The landing site was the Taurus Littrow Valley, a narrow canyon in the lunar highlands near the edge of Mare Serenitatis, a dark basalt plain that formed billions of years ago when a massive asteroid impact melted rock deep in the lunar interior, and it poured back to the surface like slow black water. The valley itself was chosen because the science team believed it contained both ancient highland material and younger volcanic material in close proximity, which meant Schmitt could sample a broader geological history of the Moon in a single mission than had been possible anywhere else. The risk was that the valley was surrounded by mountains over 2 kilometers high on either side. The descent would be tight. The decision to cancel Apollo 18, 19, and 20 had been made in September of 1970, 2 years before Apollo 17 launched. It was announced by NASA Administrator Thomas Paine, with language that framed it as a budget reallocation, a responsible adjustment given the costs of maintaining the program. The public statement was measured and administrative. But inside the astronaut corps and inside the science community that had been preparing experiments for those missions, the response was different. Geologists who had spent years developing lunar surface traverse plans for the cancelled missions understood immediately what was being lost. Not just the science, though the science loss was real and significant. What was being lost was time. The window for human lunar exploration, which had opened so dramatically in 1969, was closing faster than anyone had anticipated when the program began. Cernan knew this before anyone told him officially. The culture of the astronaut corps was such that information moved through informal channels faster than through official ones. He had known for months before the public announcement that the program was being cut back, and he had spent that time thinking about what it meant for the mission he was scheduled to command. He had already been on 2 space flights. He had already been to the Moon. On Apollo 10, the dress rehearsal mission that flew to within 8 miles of the surface, but did not land. He knew what the experience was, and he understood, in a way that only someone who had been there could understand, exactly what was being given up. In the weeks before the December 1972 launch, reporters asked Cernan repeatedly about the pressure of commanding the last Apollo mission. He gave different answers in different contexts, but the one that comes through most clearly in retrospect is the one he gave when someone asked whether he felt any particular responsibility to the astronauts who would never get to go. He said yes. He said he felt responsible to every person who had worked on the Apollo program, every engineer and technician and flight controller and scientist who had put years of their life into building something that was now being ended. He said the way to honor that was to do the mission as well as it could possibly be done, to get the science, to stay on the surface as long as the mission profile allowed, to bring back everything the program had been designed to produce. What comes next is the part that everyone who watched the launch understood in a way that viewers watching a recording later might not fully grasp. When the Saturn V ignited at 12:33 in the morning, it was not just a rocket launch, it was an ending. Everyone at Kennedy Space Center that night, everyone on the beaches and the roadsides for 30 miles in every direction, knew they were watching something that would not happen again in their lifetimes. The Saturn V was the most powerful machine human beings had ever built. 5 F1 engines in the first stage, each one producing 1,500,000 pounds of thrust, together moving 7 million pounds of vehicle from standing still to over 6,000 miles per hour in under 3 minutes. The sound of it was not a sound in the ordinary sense. It was a physical event. People who stood within a mile of the launch pad described feeling it in their sternum, in their teeth, in the bones of their forearms. And on that December night, that physical event lit up the Florida sky at midnight so completely that people who had been asleep miles away woke up thinking something was wrong. The glow was visible from space. Astronauts on previous missions had described seeing rocket launches from orbit, and the Saturn V was the only rocket whose exhaust plume was bright enough to track from that altitude. Think about that for a second. The last Saturn V launch was bright enough to see from space, and inside that column of fire, in a spacecraft at the top of that column, 3 men were doing the job they had trained for. Not heroically, not dramatically, in the way the word drama gets used about space missions in retrospect, methodically, checking switches, monitoring gauges, communicating with Houston in the clipped, precise language of people who have rehearsed this moment so many times that the procedure is muscle memory. Ron Evans, making his first spaceflight, was running the same checklist he had run in the simulator hundreds of times. Cernan, making his third, was doing the same. Schmitt, the geologist who had learned to fly jets specifically to earn his seat on this mission, was doing the same. The Saturn V did not care who was inside it or what the mission meant historically. It was a machine. It did what machines do, which is function according to the physical laws that govern it, or fail according to those same laws. On December 7th, 1972, it functioned. All 3 stages burned on schedule. The parking orbit insertion was clean. The translunar injection burn went as planned, and the crew separated from the S-IVB and began the 3-day transit to the moon. But this was not just any transit. This particular crew, on this particular mission, was carrying something the earlier missions had not carried in quite the same way. Not additional equipment, though Apollo 17 did carry the most comprehensive scientific payload of any Apollo landing. Something less tangible, the awareness that every observation mattered, that every data point was potentially the last one of its kind. The transcripts of their conversations with mission control, the photographs they took, the samples Cernan and Schmitt would collect from the surface of the Taurus Littrow Valley were going to constitute the final primary data from human beings standing on another world for an indefinite period that nobody then could quantify. It turned out to be more than 50 years and counting. That awareness shaped how the crew worked. It shaped the care Schmitt took with his geological descriptions on the surface, the thoroughness of his sample documentation, the precision of his traverse planning. It shaped the attention Evans brought to the scientific instrument module observations from orbit, and it shaped the way Cernan communicated with mission control throughout the mission, the deliberateness with which he reported what he saw, the refusal to round off or simplify or skip past anything that might be the last example of its kind. And here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. That same deliberateness, that same trained refusal to round off or simplify, is what makes the sighting reports in the transcripts so significant. These were not men looking for something to report. They were men focused on a checklist that was already more demanding than any previous mission. When they reported unusual observations, they reported them because the unusual observations were real, and because that is what you do when you are doing this job correctly. You do not editorialize. You do not decide in advance what is worth noting and what is not. You observe and you transmit. This was not just about the crew's training anymore. It was about what the last mission meant for everything that came after it. Because if the final crew of the Apollo program recorded something in their transcripts that they could not explain, and that document was then classified and held for over 50 years, then the question of what they saw becomes a question about the last thing human beings reported from beyond the atmosphere before the long silence that followed. And that silence lasted from December of 1972 until this morning. The flight to the moon takes approximately 3 days. The spacecraft separates from the Saturn V's 3rd stage, turns around, docks with the lunar module that is stored inside the upper section of the rocket, pulls it free, and then the rocket stage fires its engine one more time to send itself toward the moon on a trajectory that will end in a controlled crash, because the impact vibrations are useful data for the seismometers the earlier crews had left on the surface. It is a long journey by any normal measure. 3 days of drifting through a vacuum at speeds that feel almost imperceptible from inside the spacecraft. The Earth gets smaller, the moon gets larger. The stars do not change. They are always there, and they are always many more of them than you would ever see from the ground, because there is no atmosphere to scatter the light. It was during this transit, during those 3 quiet days between one world and another, that the events described in the declassified documents began. The first event happened approximately 3 hours and 34 minutes after launch. The spacecraft had just completed its separation from the S-IVB, the third stage of the Saturn V, which had done its job and was now drifting away on its own trajectory. Separation was a standard procedure, a routine moment in the mission, but what happened in the minutes after separation was not. Ron Evans was looking out the window. What he saw, he reported immediately, and the conversation that followed was recorded. The recording was transcribed. The transcript was marked confidential, and this morning, for the first time in 53 years, anyone could read it. Before we get into what Evans said, it is worth pausing for a moment to understand what the view from a spacecraft window actually is. People have this idea that space is dramatic and busy, full of objects drifting past and light shows and spectacle. The reality is almost the opposite. Space, for the most part, is nothing. As if is a black field interrupted by stars that are so far away, they look like painted points of light. When you see debris or particles near a spacecraft, it stands out against that background in a way that is immediately obvious. There is nothing to confuse it with. There is no atmospheric haze, no ambient light, no background clutter. If something is moving through your field of view against that black background, you are going to see it. You are going to see it clearly, and your brain is going to register it as significant, because your brain evolved to detect motion against a uniform background, and it does that job extremely well. Ron Evans was not a man who misidentified things. He had spent years in high-performance aircraft, where misidentifying what you were looking at had consequences measured in lives, including your own. He looked out the window. He saw something. He said something. And what he said was the beginning of a conversation that would last for several days, cover multiple separate sighting events, and end with a United States commander providing a precise positional fix on an object he could not identify in the hatch window of a spacecraft traveling to the moon, while Mission Control in Houston asked him to keep tracking it through the optical instruments. That is where we are going next. But first, understand what kind of men these 3 were. Understand the training, the discipline, the standard of observation. Understand that these were not civilians, not enthusiasts, not people with something to gain from reporting the unusual. They were federal employees doing the most demanding job in the history of human civilization. They reported what they saw, because reporting what you see is what you do. It is the job. You do not editorialize. You do not speculate beyond what the evidence supports. You observe, you describe, you transmit. And when you hear what they transmitted, across the distance of 53 years, in their own words, in their own voices as captured on that tape and transcribed onto those pages, you will understand why those pages were marked confidential. And you will understand why the question they left open is still open today. 3 hours and 34 minutes after leaving Earth, Ron Evans looked out the window and said something that Mission Control had not been expecting. To understand exactly what was happening at the moment, you need to know about the S-IVB. The S-IVB was the third stage of the Saturn V's rocket, and it was the stage that had just completed its job. After the first and second stages burned out and fell away during the climb to orbit, the S-IVB fired its engine to push the spacecraft into a parking orbit around the Earth, then fired again to send the crew on their trajectory toward the Moon. That second burn was called the translunar injection, and once it was done, the S-IVB had no more work to do. The crew would separate from it, turn the command module around, dock with the lunar module that was stored in the top section of the rocket, extract it, and then fly away. The S-IVB, now empty and drifting, would fire its small attitude control engines one final time to send itself on a trajectory toward the lunar surface, where it would crash and send useful seismic data back to the instruments the previous crews had placed on the Moon. So at 3 hours and 34 minutes into the mission, the separation from the S-IVB had just been completed. The spacecraft was now flying on its own. The crew was maneuvering, and Ron Evans, who was sitting at the command module pilot position with a view out the side window, saw something outside. He reported it immediately, but before we get to what Evans said, it is worth understanding exactly what the S-IVB was, because most people who hear the name have no mental image of what we are actually talking about, and the physical reality of it matters for understanding what the crew was looking at. The S-IVB was not a small component. It was a cylinder approximately 58 feet long and 22 feet in diameter, roughly the size of a 6-story building laid on its side. Its exterior was covered in a combination of insulating foam, paint, and metallic panels, all of which had been subjected to the violence of launch, the thermal shock of passing through the atmosphere at high speed, and the extreme temperature differential of space, where surfaces in direct sunlight can reach over 250 degrees Fahrenheit, while surfaces in shadow drop to nearly 300 degrees below zero. Those temperature extremes do things to materials. They cause expansion and contraction, cycling repeatedly as the stage rotated in sunlight and shadow. Paint that had been applied months earlier in a controlled environment at the factory had now been through conditions it was never designed to survive indefinitely. Foam insulation that had been bonded to the exterior under controlled conditions was now experiencing stress it had never experienced in testing. And the pressurized fuel and oxidizer lines that ran through the interior of the stage, now empty and depressurized after the engine burn, were settling into new configurations as the residual temperatures equalized. All of that is context for what Evans saw. When the crew separated from the S-IVB and maneuvered away from it, they were separating from a structure that had just survived one of the most violent sequences of events in engineering. And as they maneuvered, the thruster firings that reoriented the spacecraft sent tiny pressure waves through the local environment, not through the vacuum itself, because sound does not travel in vacuum, but through anything that was still loosely attached to either vehicle, through residual fuel vapor that had vented during the burn, through material on the exterior of the S-IVB that was already compromised by the thermal cycling and the stress of launch. In zero gravity, debris does not fall. It drifts. And it drifts in ways that are deeply counterintuitive to human beings whose entire experience of the physical world has been shaped by gravity. A paint chip that separates from the exterior of the S-IVB in zero gravity does not arc downward. It continues on whatever trajectory it had at the moment of separation, modified only by the extremely slight gravitational influence of the nearby spacecraft and the faint radiation pressure of sunlight, which means it can drift in any direction. It can appear to rise, fall, move laterally, move directly toward the observer, or move directly away, all depending on the geometry of the separation and the initial conditions. And in direct sunlight, with no atmospheric scattering to diffuse the light, a thin reflective fragment the size of a playing card can catch the sun at just the right angle and produce a flash of reflected light that looks, from inside the spacecraft, like something much larger and much brighter than it actually is. The optics of debris in space are deceptive in exactly that way. Small objects look large. Dim surfaces look bright. The absence of atmospheric haze means there is no visual cue to help you calibrate distance or size. This is not a version of what might explain it. This is the version that Evans and Cernan and Schmitt were working with in real time. They knew all of this. They had trained for orbital mechanics and spacecraft systems and the behavior of materials in the space environment. They were not naive observers being fooled by optical illusions they had never encountered before. And that is exactly why the language Evans used matters so much. Now, we've got a few very bright particles or fragments or something that go drifting by as we maneuver. Notice what Evans does with his language right from the start. He does not say he knows what they are. He does not say debris or ice or paint. He says particles or fragments or something. 3 words strung together with or, because he is describing what he is seeing as accurately as he can. And what he is seeing does not immediately fit a category he can name with confidence. He is a trained observer doing exactly what trained observers do, which is describe the phenomenon and resist the urge to label it prematurely. He did not say fragments. He said particles or fragments or something. That or something at the end of the phrase is not filler. It is precision. He is covering the possibility that what he is looking at does not fit either of the 2 categories he just named. Particles suggest small, uniform, naturally occurring material. Fragments suggest pieces broken from a larger structure. Or something is Evans leaving the door open for a 3rd category that he cannot name yet because he does not know what it is. Mission control acknowledged. Roger. Understand. Then Jack Schmitt, the Lunar Module Pilot, looked out his own window. There's a whole bunch of big ones on my window down there, just bright. It looks like the 4th of July out of Ron's window. Read that again. A whole bunch. Big ones. Just bright. The 4th of July. Schmitt is a scientist. He has a doctorate from Harvard. His instinct when he observes something is to describe it with precision, and his description in this moment is not technical. It is visual. Because what he is seeing is visually striking enough that the most accurate thing he can reach for is a fireworks display. Something bright, something multiple, something moving. Evans looked more carefully. Yes, now you can see some of them in shape. They're very jagged, angular fragments that are tumbling. Now we have something more specific. Jagged, angular, tumbling. These are not words you use to describe a uniform substance, like ice crystals or paint chips, in the way most people picture them. Jagged and angular suggests irregular structure, edges, corners. Tumbling suggests rotation, momentum, pieces of something that were part of a larger object and are now separating. Mission Control, listening to all of this in Houston, asked a question. Roger. They look like fluid of some sort. Evans answered immediately. Not to me. They look like pieces of something. They're very bright. Not fluid. Pieces of something. He is being precise. He is rejecting the easier explanation in favor of the more accurate description. They look solid. They look like they came from somewhere. Mission Control pushed further. Do you think you can figure out what they might be? And this is the moment where the transcript gets genuinely interesting. Because Evans tried. He actually thought it through out loud, in real time, while traveling to the moon. And here is what he said. Well, you know, I don't know. There are a number of possibilities. If you had some kind of I got the impression maybe they were curved a little bit, as if they might be off the side of the S-IVB. And that's a wild guess. Ice chunks, possibly. Or maybe there's paint coming off of it. Read that carefully. That's a wild guess. Those are his words, not a conclusion, not an assessment. A wild guess. Ron Evans, a man trained to assess conditions under pressure, is telling Mission Control that the explanation he is about to offer is speculation. He's flagging his own uncertainty before he even gives the hypothesis. That is not the behavior of someone brushing something off. That is the behavior of someone who genuinely does not know what they are looking at and is being honest about it. The hypotheses he offered were the S-IVB, ice chunks, or paint. And those are all reasonable guesses. The S-IVB had just separated and could have shed material. Ice can form on the exterior of spacecraft and break off during maneuvers. Paint does peel from rocket surfaces, as Mission Control was about to confirm, because Mission Control came back with this. I noticed on one trip up the elevator last week near one of the flags. I thought it was on the S-IVB, but it might have been on the SVB. Looked like it was peeling. Maybe that's what you've got. That is a technician in Houston, someone who had been physically present near the rocket before launch, telling the crew that yes, he had seen peeling material on the upper stages. That gives Evans's paint hypothesis some grounding. It is not coming from nowhere, but notice that Mission Control's response is also speculative. Maybe that's what you've got. Not that's definitely what you're seeing. Maybe. Gene Cernan, who had been observing from his own position, added his description. My impression is that they are flat, flake-like particles. Some may be 6 inches across, and although there's no relative motion between the two, most of them seem to be twinkling, and I think, for the most part, they're all moving away from us. 6 inches across, flat and flake-like, twinkling, moving away from the spacecraft. Cernan is giving Houston everything he can. He is trying to quantify the size, the surface behavior, the motion. 6 inches is not a tiny fleck of paint. 6 inches is a substantial piece of something. And twinkling suggests reflectivity, a surface that is catching and throwing light as it rotates, which is consistent with a thin, flat object spinning slowly in sunlight, catching the light on one face and losing it on the other. Evans then added one more observation that tends to get overlooked when people summarize this event. Every once in a while, a fragment of considerably higher velocity than the others goes across my window, but that's very rare. Considerably higher velocity. One of the fragments was moving significantly faster than the others. That is a detail that does not fit cleanly into the peeling paint hypothesis. Paint chips shed from a rocket during a slow maneuver should behave in roughly similar ways. They should drift away at similar speeds. A fragment with considerably higher velocity suggests something different. Maybe a pressurized release, maybe a piece that was already under tension when it separated. Evans notes it and flags it as rare. He does not build a theory on it, but he puts it in the record. But the version you have probably heard about this event focuses on the headline, the 4th of July description, the wild guess, the paint chips. That framing is accurate as far as it goes. but it does not capture the full texture of the exchange. Because here is what the transcript actually shows when you read it carefully. Evans reported the objects. Schmitt confirmed them from his window with his own description. Cernan added a third independent description with different specific details, flat and flake-like, and 6 inches across and twinkling. 3 separate observers, 3 separate windows, 3 separate descriptions that partially overlap and partially diverge. The overlap, bright, multiple, moving, is the core observation they all agree on. The divergences, jagged and angular from Evans, flat and flake-like from Cernan, tell you they were not simply confirming each other's report. They were independently observing and independently describing, and their descriptions reflected what each of them could actually see from their specific position in the spacecraft. That is not how a misidentification typically works. Misidentification tends to produce converging descriptions because the observer is fitting what they see to a category they have already decided on. Independent descriptions that diverge in specific ways suggest independent observation of something that does not fit a single clean category. And then there is the fragment with considerably higher velocity. Evans noted it almost in passing, flagged it as rare, and moved on. But that detail has a specific implication that the rest of the exchange does not address. If the debris was shed from the S-IVB during the separation maneuver, all of it should have been shed under roughly similar conditions and should be moving at roughly similar velocities relative to the spacecraft. A fragment with considerably higher velocity is a fragment that either separated earlier under different conditions or was under some form of stored energy, compression or tension or internal pressure that released at the moment of separation and sent it moving faster than the surrounding material. Neither of those explanations is exotic. Both are physically plausible, but neither was confirmed. And then, after the maneuver was complete, Evans made one final observation that has a slightly different quality to it than everything that came before. My gosh, look at the junk. That is not a scientific assessment. That is a human being looking out a window at something unexpected and reacting. My gosh, look at the junk. There is something in those words that exists outside the formal language of mission communication. Something that suggests the volume or the character of what he was seeing was enough to produce a genuine unscripted reaction. Not alarm, but something. For a while, things actually settled down. The fragment field dispersed. The crew moved through the checklist. Houston and the crew discussed the upcoming transposition and docking maneuver. The conversation became routine again. That detail about the higher velocity fragment was a foreshadowing nobody recognized at the time, because 2 days later, Evans and Cernan and Schmitt would find themselves looking at something else outside the windows that was also moving differently from what they expected, also producing a pattern of reflected light that did not fit any simple category, also generating a conversation with mission control that ended without a confirmed explanation. After the spacecraft completed its maneuver, Evans reported that the fragment field was essentially static, with only very slight tumbling within the fragments. They were not pursuing the spacecraft. They were drifting in the same region where the separation had occurred, slowly rotating and moving away. And after a few minutes, they passed out of the field of view. The event was noted. The conversation was recorded. And mission control and the crew moved on to the next item on the checklist. Now, the photograph. The image that was released this morning, the one that appears in the declassified documents under the designation NASA UAP VM6, Apollo 17 Lunar 1972, was taken during this period of the mission. It shows a view looking away from the spacecraft toward the lunar terrain below, and in the sky above, the terrain. 3 points of light are visible. They have been highlighted in the original image with a yellow box, drawing the eye to exactly where you need to look. 3 points of light in the sky above the moon, in a photograph taken by the crew of Apollo 17 in December of 1972 and classified by the United States government for over 50 years. The most likely explanation, based on the transcript, is that this photograph captures some of the objects Evans and Schmitt and Cernan were describing during the fragment field event. The timing aligns. The visual description aligns. Jagged, angular, bright objects at some distance from the spacecraft, caught in a photograph taken toward the lunar surface. But here is the thing. The government did not release this photograph with a caption that says, "These are paint chips from the S-IVB." They did not release it with a caption that says, "This has been explained." They released it under the Pursue program as an unresolved case. That is the official determination. After 53 years, with access to every piece of mission data, every transcript, every telemetry reading, the official position of the United States government is that the nature of what is shown in this photograph cannot be definitively determined. That does not mean it is extraterrestrial. It does not mean the mundane explanations are wrong. It means the mundane explanations were never confirmed with enough specificity to close the case. The hypothesis that these were debris from the S-IVB was never verified against the actual photograph. The paint peeling that the technician mentioned before launch was never matched to what appeared in the image. The case stayed open because open was the honest answer, and the honest answer, 53 years later, is still open. But this was only the beginning of what the crew of Apollo 17 reported seeing, because 2 days later, further from the Earth than almost any human being had ever been, Gene Cernan looked out the hatch window and saw something that he was far more emphatic about. Something he could not explain away, even after trying. Something that he described with the kind of certainty that trained pilots use when they are not guessing. Something that made mission control go quiet for a moment, then ask him to give them a positional fix so they could try to track it through the spacecraft optics. 2 days and 18 hours into the mission, the crew of Apollo 17 was in the quiet middle stretch of the transit to the moon. The fragment field event was behind them. The excitement of launch, the physical violence of the Saturn V climb, the complex choreography of separation and docking, all of it was done. What remained for the next several hours was the long, unhurried drift through the dark. The Earth behind them was a small blue disk, shrinking slowly. The moon ahead was growing, but not fast enough to watch in real time. The spacecraft was traveling at roughly 3,000 miles per hour, which sounds fast until you consider the distance involved, and then it sounds almost impossibly slow. The crew had settled into the rhythm of deep space transit. Meals, systems checks, sleep cycles, experiments. The ALFMED experiment, which we will come back to later, was running. Schmitt was making observations. Evans was monitoring systems. Cernan was doing what commanders do, which is keeping track of everything and everyone at once. And then someone noticed something outside. The transcript does not record exactly who saw it first. What it records is that by the time Cernan addressed Mission Control about it, Jack Schmitt had already been looking at it. Cernan's first words on the subject reference what Jack was talking about, which means the object had been observed and discussed between the crew before it was formally reported to Houston. That is worth noting. These were not men who rushed to report something unusual. They looked at it themselves first. They talked it over. And then, when Cernan decided it warranted a transmission, he opened the channel and described it in the precise, measured language of a man who has spent his career translating observation into communication. "Hey Bob, I'm looking at what Jack was talking about. And it's definitely not a particle that's nearby because there is another one I can look at and get a three-dimensional comparison with." Stop there. That first sentence is doing a lot of work. Cernan is telling Mission Control something specific about his methodology. He is not just looking at the object in isolation. He is comparing it against another object, a known object, a particle that is close to the spacecraft, in order to establish a three-dimensional reference frame. He is using parallax. He's doing what a trained observer does, which is not just describe what he sees, but describe how he knows what he sees. He continues, "It is a bright object, and it's obviously rotating because it's flashing. It's way out, in the distance, as I say, because there are particles that are close by, and it's obviously not one of those. It's apparently rotating in a very rhythmic fashion because the flashes come around almost on time. Obviously rotating. Obviously not one of the nearby particles. Very rhythmic, almost on time." Read those phrases in sequence and you get the picture of a man who is not excited, not alarmed, not speculating. He is analyzing. He is watching something rotate and counting the flashes and concluding from the rhythm that the rotation is consistent. That is a scientific observation. That is what you do when you are trying to characterize an unknown object. You look for pattern. You look for regularity. You look for the kind of behavior that lets you draw conclusions about what you are looking at. And then comes the line. And it's as we look back at the Earth, it's up at about 11 swant, about, maybe 10 or 12 Earth diameters. I don't know whether that does you any good, but there is something out there. There is something out there. Direct, unhedged. Not there might be something. Not I think I can see something. Not something that looks like it might be. There is something out there. Cernan has done his analysis. He has made his comparison. And he has arrived at a conclusion that he is willing to state flatly to Mission Control with no qualification attached. Mission Control responded, "Roger, we don't doubt it, Gene. And we might work out a set of gimbal angles or something here. Maybe we can get a look at it through the optics. We don't doubt it, Gene. That is not a dismissal. That is the opposite of a dismissal." Mission Control is accepting Cernan's report as credible and immediately proposing a course of action to gather more data. They want to look at it through the spacecraft's optical instruments. They want to try to get an independent observation from their end, using the attitude of the spacecraft as a reference frame. But before that could happen, Cernan added something. "Okay, and I just want to emphasize that it is definitely not one of these particles that tends to look like a star out there. It's something physical in the distance. It's something physical in the distance." That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment. Cernan is preempting a misunderstanding. He knows that from Houston's perspective, with no visual reference, it would be easy to wonder whether he is simply looking at a particle close to the spacecraft that looks bright and distant because of the way light behaves in a vacuum. He has already considered that possibility. He has already rejected it because of the three-dimensional comparison he made at the start. And now he is making absolutely sure that Mission Control understands what he is ruling out and why. It is something physical, in the distance. Mission Control came back with a specific request. "Okay, Gene. If you can call up a noun 20 so we know the spacecraft attitude, and if you can reference the object you're looking at out of your window with respect to body axis, and let us look at your, give us a mark somehow, and give us your nan 20s. We can try and get a tie-in and start locating this object. A noun 20 is a specific readout from the spacecraft guidance computer that gives the current attitude of the vehicle in space. Mission Control is asking Cernan to feed them the spacecraft's exact orientation so that they can cross-reference his reported line of sight with known star positions and try to identify what he is looking at, or at least fix its approximate location in space. This is not a casual request. This is an actual investigative procedure. They are trying to track the object. Cernan got to work. Okay. I'm looking at it out the center window, the hatch window, and I'll give you a hack when it crosses the x axis at the center window. And I guess it's up maybe 45 degrees. He is describing the geometry of his observation. The XX axis is a defined reference line on the spacecraft's coordinate system. He is going to mark the exact moment the object crosses that line, which gives Mission Control a precise angular reference, combined with the noun 20 attitude data that gives them enough information to begin calculating where in space the object is located. Then he marked it. Okay, mark it. It just crossed through the, let's call it the XZ plane of the spacecraft. Mission Control confirmed immediately. Mark, we got it. They got it. They have a fix. They have a timestamp, a spacecraft attitude, and a line of sight. Whatever Cernan was looking at, its position has been recorded with enough precision that Mission Control now has data to work with. And then Cernan described the object in more detail. One unique thing about it, Bob, is that it's got two flashes. As it comes around in rhythmic fashion, you get a very bright flash, and then you get a dull flash, and then it'll come around with a bright flash, and then a dull flash. Two flashes per rotation, one bright, one dull, alternating in a consistent pattern. Bright, dull, rhythmic and repeating. This is the kind of detail that tells you something about the object's physical structure. An object producing two different intensities of reflected light as it rotates is an object with two distinctly different surfaces. One surface is more reflective than the other, which means the object has visible structure. It has sides. Jack Schmitt, who had also been watching, offered an explanation. That's the side end of the S-IVB, and then the engine bell, Gene. The S-IVB again. Schmitt is suggesting that the two flash pattern is consistent with a rotating S-IVB stage, where the cylindrical body of the rocket reflects light differently than the engine bell at the base. The side of the rocket is a broad, curved, relatively uniform surface. The engine bell is a different shape entirely, a deep cone that would reflect light at a different angle. As the S-IVB rotated, you might expect exactly the alternating bright and dull pattern Cernan was describing. It is a reasonable hypothesis. Schmitt is not making it up. He is applying what he knows about the shape of the S-IVB to what Cernan is describing, and the fit is plausible. But Cernan never explicitly agreed with it. Read the transcript, and you will not find Cernan saying, yes, that's it, that must be the S-IVB. What you find is that the conversation moved on. The object continued to be observed. Schmitt refined his own assessment over the following minutes, noting that when he had looked at it earlier through the monocular, he had a much brighter view, suggesting he had been looking at it broadside, and that it appeared to be rotating more end-on now, which is why it seemed dimmer. Then Schmitt added something interesting. I just hadn't put it together as maybe being the S of B. I thought it was just some other particle out there. He thought it was just some other particle out there. Schmitt had been watching this object for a while before he connected it to the S-IVB hypothesis. And even then, his language is careful. Maybe being the S-IVB, not definitely, not confirmed, maybe. And here is what the transcript does not contain. It does not contain a moment where mission control came back with confirmation. It does not contain a moment where they cross-referenced the positional fix Cernan gave them against the known trajectory of the S-IVB and said, yes, we can confirm that is the S-IVB at those coordinates. The conversation drifted to other subjects. Cernan asked about the Dallas Cowboys score. Schmitt started talking about cloud formations on the Earth below. The object faded from the record. The case stayed open. Now, there is something else in this section of the transcript that deserves attention, and it comes from Cernan rather than from the other two. It is a short passage, and it is easy to miss if you are reading quickly, but it changes the character of what we are looking at in a meaningful way. After the formal positional fix, after the exchange about the double flash pattern, after Schmitt offered the S-IVB hypothesis, Cernan went back to something he'd been thinking about, and he said this: I just want to emphasize that it's definitely not one of these particles that tends to look like a star out there. It's something physical in the distance. He said it twice, in slightly different words, but the same statement, repeated. Definitely not a nearby particle, something physical, in the distance. Pilots do not repeat themselves by accident. When a trained aviator says something twice, it is because they want to make sure it is in the record. Cernan was making sure. He wanted it documented that his assessment, after observation and analysis, was that this object was real, was distant, and was not the same category of thing as the debris field they had encountered hours earlier. That is not speculation. That is a commander putting his professional judgment on record. And the record stayed classified for 53 years. Here is what the government knows today that it has not fully explained. They know the trajectory of the S-IVB after separation. They know where it was, hour by hour, during the Apollo 17 mission. They have the noun 20 data that Cernan provided. They have the timestamp of his mark. They could, theoretically, cross-reference those data points against the S-IVB's known position at that moment and determine whether what Cernan was describing was geometrically consistent with the rocket stage or not. Whether that analysis was ever done is not stated in the documents released this morning. What is stated in the official description of these files is that this case is unresolved. After everything, after 53 years, after all the data that existed, after all the people who had access to all of it, the official answer is still the same word that Evans used when he first tried to explain what he was looking at during the fragment field. A wild guess. That is not a satisfying answer, but it is an honest one. And honesty, in this story, turns out to be rarer than you might expect, because there is still more. There is a third phenomenon that the crew reported across multiple nights of the mission, something that every single one of them experienced, and something that has a scientific explanation that is fascinating in its own right, separate from anything else we have discussed tonight. There is a third thing in these transcripts that almost nobody is talking about today. It is not a photograph. It is not a rotating object at distance. It is something more personal than either of those, and in some ways more unsettling, because it happened not outside the spacecraft, but inside it. It happened in the dark, in the sleeping hours, when the crew had their eyes closed and the cabin was quiet, and there was nothing between them and the void of deep space, but a thin aluminum hull and a few inches of insulation. They were seeing lights. Not lights from the instruments, not lights from the windows. Lights that appeared when their eyes were closed, in the absolute darkness of a spacecraft running in night mode, in the middle of an empty region of space where no external light source could account for what they were experiencing. Flashes, streaks. In one case, something Cernan described as a very bright spot that went off right between his eyes, like a train headlight coming straight at him in the dark. All three of them saw it, every night of the mission. The entry in the transcript, where this is discussed at length, comes from tape 46, approximately 2 days and 18 hours into the flight, during the same general period as the rotating object event. The crew had just finished the ALFMED experiment, which stands for Apollo Light Flash Moving Emulsion Detector, a piece of equipment specifically designed to study exactly the phenomenon they had been experiencing. And after the experiment concluded, Cernan opened the channel to mission control and started talking. He had been waiting to describe this properly. The first night I was in bed, I definitely saw some of these, because I had a hard time going to bed to start with. I saw some sets of the streaks, and probably the one most imposing thing I remember is, and the last one I remember before falling asleep, was the fact that there was a very bright spot that flashed right between my eyes, like a very bright headlight, like a train coming at you, only with a flash. Like a train coming at you. That is how Cernan described it. Not a gentle glow, not a soft shimmer at the edge of vision. A very bright spot, right between the eyes, like a headlight, like something bearing down on you in the dark. And it happened in the moment just before he fell asleep, which means it was the last thing his conscious mind registered before unconsciousness took over. He continued, "It's difficult probably to estimate the frequency or any of those, because I was in a sort of a sleep hazy mode. He is flagging his own observational limitations. He knows that the data he can provide from that experience is degraded because he was not fully alert when it happened. That is intellectual honesty. He is telling mission control exactly how much weight to give to that particular description, which is not something a person embellishing a story typically does. Then he said something that is the clearest single statement in the entire transcript on this subject. No question in my mind, but that they're there. Last trip I took, I guess I just wasn't looking for them or paying any attention to them. Maybe they were there and I ignored them because of other things. But they're there. No question in his mind. They are there. He had been on 2 previous space flights, Gemini 9 and Apollo 10, and now he was saying that he suspected the phenomenon had been present on those missions too. Only he had not been paying attention to it. Now that he was paying attention, now that there was an experiment specifically designed to study it, he could confirm without qualification that the flashes were real and that he was experiencing them. Jack Schmitt, in his own observations, described something even broader. We had light flashes just about continuously during the whole flight when we were dark adapted. Just about continuously. That is not an occasional anomaly. That is a persistent background experience present whenever the crew was in darkness and their eyes had adjusted. Schmitt went further, noting that he had one flash that he thought was a flash on the lunar surface, which is significant because the lunar surface was outside the spacecraft, visible through the window, not inside the cabin. He was distinguishing between the internal flashes and something he perceived as external. That distinction tells you his mind was actively sorting and categorizing what he was seeing, rather than lumping it all together. Ron Evans, characteristically understated, added one sentence. It might be interesting to know I've never seen it before today. Evans had not experienced the light flashes on previous missions. This was his first space flight. He had no prior reference frame, and the first time he encountered the phenomenon was during this mission, on this day. That data point matters because it means the flashes were not something he had primed himself to expect. He had no expectation of seeing them. He saw them anyway, now. Here is where the science comes in. And the science is genuinely fascinating in a way that does not diminish the experience the crew was describing, but instead makes it richer. The lights the crew of Apollo 17 were seeing are real. They are caused by cosmic rays. Cosmic rays are high-energy particles, mostly protons and atomic nuclei, that travel through space at velocities approaching the speed of light. They are produced by some of the most violent events in the universe: supernova explosions, neutron star collisions, active galactic nuclei, the kinds of events that release energy so large they make a nuclear weapon look like a struck match. Those particles travel outward from their source across interstellar space, and a portion of them, after journeys of hundreds or thousands of light years, pass through our solar system. On Earth, the atmosphere absorbs most of them before they reach the surface. But in space, there is no atmosphere. There is nothing between you and the particle stream. When a cosmic ray particle passes through the human eye, specifically through the retina or the vitreous humor, the clear gel that fills the eye, it interacts with the tissue in a way that produces a flash of light. The particle is not producing the light directly. It is depositing energy as it passes through the biological tissue, and that energy is converted into a visual signal by the retina's photoreceptors, which respond to the energy input the same way they respond to actual photons of light. Your eye cannot tell the difference between a photon of light hitting a photoreceptor and a cosmic ray particle depositing energy in the same location. The signal is the same. The experience is a flash of light. This is not a theory. It is not a hypothesis. It was a known phenomenon before Apollo 17 launched. Astronauts on earlier missions had reported it, and the scientific community had identified cosmic rays as the likely cause. The AlphaMed experiment that the crew ran during this mission was specifically designed to gather data on the phenomenon, to try to characterize the relationship between the type of cosmic ray particle, its energy level, and the visual experience it produced in human observers. So when Cernan described the train headlight flash between his eyes, he was describing a high-energy cosmic ray particle passing through the center of his visual field at close to the speed of light. When Schmitt described continuous flashing throughout the dark adapted periods of the mission, he was describing a baseline rate of cosmic ray exposure that was significantly higher than anything a person on Earth would ever experience. When Evans described seeing it for the first time, he was reporting his first encounter with a phenomenon that is invisible on Earth, but becomes unavoidable in deep space. The flashes are real. The explanation is physics. And the physics is not comforting in the way that a mundane explanation is supposed to be comforting, because what it actually tells you is that the crew of Apollo 17 spent their sleeping hours being penetrated by high-energy particles from exploded stars. Particles that were depositing their energy directly into the tissue of their eyes and brains, producing light shows that no one on the surface of the Earth would ever see. That is extraordinary in itself, and it is completely true and completely documented, and it has nothing to do with anything unexplained. But here is what makes the AlphaMed section of the transcript worth reading in full, beyond just the light flash data. Cernan described something during this section that sits slightly apart from the cosmic ray explanation. He said that during today's session, he saw some that flashed and lit up the horizon, and some that lit up peripherally. and he noted that Mission Control had told him those types of observations were a different kind of data from what the experiment was designed to capture. They were not the typical small localized flashes associated with single cosmic ray events. They were something more expansive, something that lit up his entire visual field at the edges. Mission Control's response to that was measured. Okay, we got all that, Gene. We were just trying to make the data fit the curve. You know the old trick. We were just trying to make the data fit the curve. That is a scientist in Houston telling a commander in space that the data they were getting was not fitting their expected model, and that they had been attempting to reconcile it rather than simply accept the discrepancy. That is an honest admission. The light flash data from this mission was producing observations that did not cleanly match what the experiment had been designed to measure, and Mission Control was aware of it. Cernan's response was simple and direct. Okay, I just told them like we saw them. That's all. I told them like we saw them. That sentence is the whole philosophy of the transcript in 8 words. That is what these 3 men did throughout the entire mission. They reported what they observed, with whatever precision they could manage, without embellishment and without suppression. When Evans did not know what the fragments were, he said he did not know. When Cernan was certain the distant object was physical, he said he was certain. When Schmitt wanted to offer a hypothesis, he labeled it as a hypothesis. When the light flashes did not fit the model, Cernan reported the light flashes as he saw them and let Mission Control figure out what to do with the data. And then Cernan said this: I will say one thing though, no question in my mind but that they're there. Last trip I took, I guess I just wasn't looking for them or paying any attention to them. Maybe they were there and I ignored them because of other things, but they're there. That is his final word on the light flashes. Certain, unambiguous, they are there. Whether or not the science fully accounts for every detail of what the crew described, the phenomenon is real, it is physical, and it is something that every human being who has traveled to deep space has encountered in some form. The crew of Apollo 17 encountered it continuously, every dark-adapted period of the mission, for 12 days. And when they came home and sat down in Houston in January of 1973 and described it to the debriefers, they described it the same way they described everything else. Precisely, carefully, without exaggeration, and without the kind of certainty that goes beyond what the evidence actually supports. Schmitt put it plainly in the post-mission science debriefing, dated January the 8th, 1973, one of the 3 documents in today's release. We had light flashes just about continuously during the whole flight. When we were dark adapted, I had one which I thought was a flash on the lunar surface. One which he thought was a flash on the lunar surface. Not one which was definitely a flash on the lunar surface. One which he thought might have been. The distinction matters. Even in describing something he had experienced directly, Schmitt was careful not to claim more certainty than he had. That is the standard these men held throughout the entire mission. That is the standard that makes their testimony worth taking seriously when they describe things they could not explain, because they were equally rigorous about what they could not explain as they were about what they could. And there is one more thing in the science debriefing that has received almost no attention today in all the coverage of these documents. Something the instruments found, something the telescope aboard the spacecraft detected during the transit, not from the crew's eyes, but from the data. Something that the lead scientist described in the debrief as potentially the most interesting result of the entire mission's astronomical observations. The crew of Apollo 17 carried eyes with them to the moon, not just their own, mounted in the scientific instrument module of the service module, the section of the spacecraft that stayed in orbit while Cernan and Schmitt descended to the lunar surface, was a suite of scientific instruments that operated continuously throughout the mission. Cameras, spectrometers, altimeters, sensors of various kinds, all collecting data automatically while the spacecraft flew its orbital track around the moon, and while the crew did their work on the surface and during the transit between worlds. One of those instruments was an ultraviolet spectrometer. Its job was to look at the sky, at regions of the sky that are impossible to study from the surface of the Earth, because the atmosphere absorbs ultraviolet light before it reaches the ground. In space, with no atmosphere in the way, the spectrometer could see wavelengths of light that no ground-based telescope ever could. And during the Apollo 17 mission, it looked at regions of the sky that nobody had examined at those wavelengths before, specifically at regions far above and far below the plane of the Milky Way galaxy, the broad flat disk of stars and gas that our solar system sits inside. What it found was not what anyone expected. The science debriefing from January the 8th, 1973, the third of the 3 documents in today's release, contains a lengthy technical discussion of the astronomical results from the mission. It is not an easy read. It is a scientist talking to other scientists about instrument calibration and spectral energy distributions and signal-to-noise ratios. But buried inside that technical language is a result that the lead scientist described, in his own words, as potentially the most interesting thing of all. He was talking about what the spectrometer found when it looked away from the plane of the galaxy, up toward what astronomers call the North Galactic Pole, and down toward the South Galactic Pole. Those directions point away from the dense, star-filled disk of the Milky Way and out into what should be, by all expectations, a much quieter region of the sky. Fewer stars, less gas, less dust, and therefore less ultraviolet light. But that is not what the spectrometer saw. The instrument detected a background of ultraviolet radiation coming from those high-latitude directions that was significantly above the expected dark count, the baseline noise level of the instrument itself. There was something producing ultraviolet light in regions of the sky where, according to everything the science team knew before the mission, there should not have been enough sources to account for it. The lead scientist walked the debriefing through the possible explanations. We know that there were no hot stars within our field of view. Therefore, the most conservative interpretation, I think, is that what we're seeing is light from hot stars in the galactic plane going up out of the plane and reflecting off interstellar dust. That is explanation 1. Starlight from the Milky Way scattering off dust clouds above and below the galactic plane. A process called diffuse galactic light. It is a real phenomenon. It is physically plausible. And it was the most conservative interpretation available, the one that required the fewest assumptions. But then he said something else. There are certain characteristics of the spectrum, though, that don't fit that theory. And it's at least possible that this is extragalactic radiation. Extragalactic radiation. Light that does not come from our galaxy at all. Light that originates somewhere beyond the Milky Way and reaches the spectrometer after traveling distances measured not in light years, but in megaparsecs, millions of light years. If that interpretation was correct, then the Apollo 17 spectrometer had detected a background of ultraviolet light from outside our galaxy that nobody had predicted and that no instrument on Earth had ever been able to see. He continued, I'm looking forward very much to the detailed computer study of this, but it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time. That was January 1973. The detailed computer study that he was looking forward to would take years, and then more years, and the question of the origin of the extragalactic ultraviolet background would become one of the persistent puzzles of observational astronomy. Decades later, ultraviolet space observatories would continue to study the problem, and the question of how much of the ultraviolet background comes from within the Milky Way and how much comes from outside it remains an active area of research. The Apollo 17 spectrometer was one of the first instruments to detect it clearly, and that result, from a mission that the public largely associates with the moon landings and the astronaut sightings in the transcripts, quietly sits in the science debriefing as a footnote to a footnote. The crew came home. The debrief happened. The document was filed. And for 53 years, the result that the lead scientist called potentially the most interesting thing of all was accessible only to people who knew it existed and knew where to look. Now it is public. Now anyone can read it. There is a pattern in these three documents that becomes visible when you read them together, and it is worth naming. The crew of Apollo 17 went to the moon and came back with observations across three distinct categories. They saw things with their eyes that they could not fully explain. They experienced things in their bodies that turned out to have a physical explanation rooted in high-energy astrophysics. And their instruments detected something in the universe that nobody had fully accounted for, and that took decades of subsequent research to begin to characterize. In each case, the response from the scientists and the crew was the same. They reported what they found. They offered the best explanations available. They flagged the cases where the explanations did not fully fit, and they moved on to the next item on the list, because there was always a next item on the list, and the mission did not stop for unresolved questions. That is how science actually works in the field, not in the clean retrospective narrative where every question gets answered in the same breath it is asked, but in real time, with incomplete data and time pressure, and a checklist that does not care how interesting your anomaly is. And all of that, the crew observations, the instrument data, the careful hedged language of people trying to describe what they found without claiming more than they could support, all of it went into documents that were marked confidential and filed away. The question of why these specific documents warranted classification is worth spending a moment on. The fragment field event could be explained, at least hypothetically, as debris from the S-IVB. The rotating object event was attributed by Schmitt to the S-IVB, though without confirmation. The light flashes have a well-understood physical explanation in cosmic rays. The ultraviolet background result was scientifically interesting, but not classified for any obvious reason. So why was the technical crew debriefing marked confidential? The documents do not say. The classification rationale is not stated in the text. What the text says on the cover page is that the document will automatically become declassified 90 days from the published date, which would have been sometime in the spring of 1973. That automatic declassification clearly did not happen, because the document stayed classified for decades afterward. Something intervened. Something caused the 90-day declassification to be overridden or ignored. What that something was is not in the documents released today. That is a gap. It is worth naming as a gap, not filling with speculation, but naming as something that the public record does not currently answer. Why was a document about a space mission marked confidential? Why did the automatic declassification not take effect? Who made the decision to keep it classified, and under what authority? Those questions are not answered in the May 8, 2026 release. What the release does answer, or at least address, is the nature of the cases themselves. And the answer, as stated by the Department of War, is unresolved, not explained, not dismissed, unresolved. That word carries real weight when you understand what it means operationally. The government has access to every piece of data that existed during and after the Apollo 17 mission. They have the telemetry, they have the trajectory data for the S-IVB, they have the spectrometer readings, they have the complete transcripts. They have had all of this for 53 years. And after all of that, with all of that data available, the official determination is that the cases cannot be definitively resolved. That is not a government agency throwing up its hands and admitting defeat. That is an agency making a specific, considered determination that the available evidence does not support a definitive conclusion. Those are different things. The first implies they stopped trying. The second implies they tried and arrived at an honest answer, which is that the honest answer is uncertainty. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. Human beings are not well equipped to live with open questions. The brain wants closure. It wants a category to put things in, a box to close, a label to apply. And so, when the government says unresolved, there is a strong instinct to read that as a euphemism, as a diplomatic way of saying something they are not willing to say directly. But there is another reading, and it is the reading that fits the evidence better. Unresolved simply means unresolved. It means the data is incomplete. It means the explanations that exist are plausible but not confirmed. It means the people who have looked at this most carefully, with access to the most information, have concluded that they do not have enough to make a definitive call. That is intellectual honesty. And intellectual honesty, as the crew of Apollo 17 demonstrated throughout their mission, is harder to maintain than it looks. What is easy is to reach for the dramatic. What is easy is to say that because something cannot be explained, it must be something extraordinary. What is hard is to sit in the middle, in the place where the explanation is plausible but not proven, and resist the pull toward either certainty. The crew of Apollo 17 sat in that middle place throughout the mission. Evans sat in it when he said, "That's a wild guess." Cernan sat in it when he said, "I don't know whether that does you any good." Schmitt sat in it when he said, "I hadn't put it together as maybe being the S-IVB." They were not ruling things out. They were not claiming things were proven. They were reporting what they saw and letting the record speak for itself. The record has been speaking for 53 years. Today, for the first time, anyone can hear it. The Apollo 17 documents are not the whole story of what was released this morning. They are 3 files in a collection of over 160. And while the crew, transcripts, and the lunar photographs have received the most attention in today's coverage, the rest of the release tells a different kind of story. Not a story about 50 years ago, about 3 men traveling to the moon in 1972 and reporting things they could not name. A story about now, about the years between then and today, about military pilots and federal employees and surveillance systems that have continued to log cases that cannot be resolved right up to the present. The Pursuit program, the Presidential Unsealing and Reporting System for UAP encounters, was not designed to release only historical documents. The mandate, as stated on the war.gov website, is to find, review, identify, declassify, and publicly release unresolved UAP-related records and historical documents in the federal government's possession. The key word in that sentence is unresolved. The government is not releasing its explained cases. It is releasing the ones it cannot account for. That framing tells you something important about the volume of what is out there. Because if the government is releasing over 160 unresolved cases in a single batch, and describing this as the first in a series of releases that will continue on a rolling basis every few weeks, then the total number of unresolved cases in the federal government's possession is not small. It is large enough that they need months of rolling releases to make it public. Large enough that dozens of agencies are involved in the review and declassification process. Large enough that the scope of the undertaking, as the Department of War's own statement described it, is unprecedented and historic. So let's go through them one by one, because each of these cases has its own character. Each one tells you something slightly different about the nature of what the government has been accumulating. And taken together, they tell a story that the summary description does not fully convey. Start with the Middle East report from May of 2022. A United States military operator was conducting surveillance operations when the object appeared on their sensor feed. The document released today includes a still frame from the video, a single captured image from what was clearly a moving recording. The object in that image is not a dot in the distance. It has visible shape. It is crossing the operator's field of view at a rate and in a manner that prompted a formal report. The operator filed that report through official channels. It was reviewed, it was assessed, and it was placed in the unresolved category, where it has remained ever since. Now consider what filing a formal UAP report actually means for a military operator. These are people whose careers depend on not being perceived as unstable or unreliable. The stigma around UAP reporting inside the military, which congressional hearings in recent years have extensively documented, has historically meant that service members who reported unusual sightings risked being seen as unserious by their peers and their superiors. The fact that a United States military operator in an active theater of operations filed a formal report about what they were seeing, knowing what that report might mean for how they were perceived, tells you something about what they saw. It was not something they could explain away. It was not something they could file under a known category and move on. It was something significant enough that they made the decision to put it on the record. If that sounds like a small thing, it isn't. The UAE report from October of 2023 is different in character. The description in the released documents refers to an inverted teardrop shape. That specific geometry matters. An inverted teardrop is wider at the top and narrower at the bottom, the opposite of what aerodynamics would produce in a conventional aircraft or balloon. A conventional fixed-wing aircraft is shaped the way it is because of how air flows over and under surfaces to generate lift. A balloon is shaped the way it is because of buoyancy and the pressure of the gas inside. An inverted teardrop moving through the air is not a shape that follows from either of those physical constraints. The document describes it flying in a manner inconsistent with known aircraft. The shape and the flight characteristics together are why this case is in the unresolved file rather than the explained file. The Greece incidents from October of 2023 are particularly interesting because there were multiple separate reports within the same time period in the same geographic region. Multiple operators, multiple instruments, multiple incidents, logged within weeks of each other in Greek airspace. One of the images in today's release shows what appears to be scope imagery, the kind of display a radar operator sees, with contact indicators that do not match the signature of a known aircraft. Another shows a visual observation of objects moving from over the ocean toward land. The combination of radar returns and visual observation in the same incident cluster is significant. Radar and visual observations can independently corroborate each other in ways that a single sensor observation cannot. When both instruments see something in the same airspace at the same time, and neither can identify it. The case for the unresolved classification becomes harder to dismiss. There's a reason this story is still talked about today, and the Greece reports are part of why. The Africa report from 2025 has less detail in the public release. What is stated is that a United States military operator reported the observation while operating within African airspace. The restraint of that description, operating within African airspace, without naming a specific country or specific mission context, tells you something about what remains classified even within the declassified release. The document has been cleared for public release, but the operational context around it has not. You get the observation, you do not get the mission. That is a deliberate choice, and it is the right one from a national security standpoint, but it means the African case sits in the release as evidence of a pattern without the surrounding context that would help make sense of it. The Japan report from 2024, filed by the United States Indo-Pacific Command, is the one that has attracted the most attention outside of the Apollo materials in today's coverage. The witnesses described the object as resembling a football in shape. That is a specific and distinctive description. Not a sphere, not a disc, not an amorphous blob. A football, oblong with defined ends, with a consistent geometry that multiple witnesses independently noted and agreed on. The object was observed near Japanese airspace. The Indo-Pacific Command, which oversees United States military operations across the Pacific region, from the west coast of the United States to the Indian subcontinent, took the report seriously enough to file it formally and retain it in the unresolved category for inclusion in today's release. And this is the part where things stopped being just a historical archive and became something current. The North America Army report from 2026 is dated this year. It is the most recent document in the entire release. A United States Army unit somewhere in North America filed a formal UAP report. It was reviewed, it was assessed, and it was placed in the unresolved file. We do not know when in 2026 this happened. We do not know the specific location beyond North America. We do not know what the Army unit was doing when the observation occurred. What we know is that, as of today, the most recent formally filed unresolved UAP case in the United States government's Declassified possession is from the same year you are watching this video. This decision to include a 2026 report in the first public release seems small when the announcement was made this morning. It isn't, because it tells you that the accumulation of unresolved cases is not slowing down. It is not a phenomenon that peaked during the Cold War and then faded as surveillance technology improved and explained more of what was being seen. The improved surveillance technology, the better cameras, the more sensitive infrared sensors, the more sophisticated radar systems, is producing more data, not fewer unresolved cases. The cases in today's release include some of the most recent observations ever made by United States military and law enforcement personnel, and they are in the unresolved file alongside a photograph taken from a spacecraft in December of 1972. The FBI infrared images deserve their own moment here. 6 separate images taken over the western United States across September and December of 2025. Black and white thermal imagery, the kind of infrared sensing that law enforcement agencies use for surveillance and search operations. Law enforcement infrared systems are designed to detect heat signatures, human bodies, vehicle engines, electrical equipment. They are calibrated against known heat sources. When an infrared system detects a point source of heat that does not match any known category, the operator knows. the system does not produce a flag automatically in most cases. The operator looks at the image and makes a judgment. In September and December of 2025, across multiple separate dates and multiple separate locations in the western United States, FBI operators looked at their infrared imagery and made the judgment that what they were seeing did not match any known category. They filed reports. The reports were reviewed. And 6 of those images, selected from what may be a larger collection of similar observations, are now publicly available on a government website. The composite sketch from April 30th, 2024 is the document in the release that most people will overlook and probably shouldn't. A composite sketch is a specific investigative artifact. It requires witnesses. It requires a trained sketch artist or a compositing process. It requires the witnesses to review the result and confirm that it matches what they observed. The composite sketch process exists to produce a reliable visual record of something that cannot be photographed directly, most commonly a person. In this case, it was used to document an anomalous sighting in the southeastern United States in September of 2023, reported by federal employees. Federal employees, not civilians, not members of the public who happen to look up at the right moment. People who work for the United States government, whose professional credibility and continued employment depend on making accurate and defensible observations and reports, observed something in the sky in September of 2023 that they could not identify, and the response of their employer was to produce a formal composite sketch and retain it in the unresolved file. And no, I'm not making that up. That document is on war.gov right now. Anyone can download it. The FBI records from January 1st, 1999 sit at the other end of the timeline. Over 26 years ago, New Year's Day, 1999. The records show unidentified aerial phenomena alongside United States military aircraft. The specific details of that case are sparse in the public release, but the fact of the case matters for the timeline. It means the government was formally logging and retaining unresolved UAP cases on a date that predates the formation of any official UAP investigation office by more than 2 decades. The Pentagon's formal UAP investigation apparatus, which became public knowledge in 2017 and was expanded by Congress in 2022, did not create the practice of logging these cases. It formalized a practice that had been ongoing for at least as long as the 1999 report, and based on the Apollo 17 documents for much longer than that. That timeline had a clock on it that nobody was watching. The releases will continue. More dates, more locations, more operators who filed reports and put their professional credibility behind the decision to say they saw something they could not explain. What connects all of these cases, from Japan in 2024 to the moon in 1972, is not the explanation. There is no common explanation. What connects them is the process. Trained observers, formal reports, professional assessment, and the same final determination, repeated across more than 50 years and more than 160 separate cases. Unresolved. Now, the government's framing of these releases is worth examining carefully, because it is more honest than government statements on this subject have historically been. The Department of War statement from this morning said that the materials consist of unresolved cases, meaning the government is unable to make a definitive determination on the nature of the observed phenomena. And then it said something that gets overlooked in most of the coverage. This can occur for a variety of reasons, including a lack of sufficient data. A lack of sufficient data. That is the government acknowledging that in at least some of these cases, the reason the case is unresolved is not that something exotic was observed and cannot be explained. It is that there was not enough data collected at the time to make any determination at all. The observation happened. It was logged. But the sensors available, the camera resolution, the radar returns, the witness accounts, whatever combination of data existed was not sufficient to allow a conclusion. That is an important distinction. Unresolved does not mean unexplainable. It means unevaluated with sufficient evidence. Some of these cases may have perfectly ordinary explanations that simply cannot be confirmed because the data is too thin to support any conclusion in either direction. The government is releasing them, not because they are necessarily anomalous, but because they are open, and the commitment is to transparency about open cases, not just about dramatic ones. But the government also said something else in its statement. It said the Department of War welcomes the application of private sector analysis, information, and expertise to these materials. That sentence is more significant than it might appear on first reading. The government is explicitly inviting outside scrutiny. It is acknowledging that its own analytical capacity may not be sufficient to resolve every case, and that the scientific community, the engineering community, and the public at large may be able to contribute something that the government cannot provide on its own. That is not the posture of an institution that is confident it has the answers and is simply choosing not to share them. That is the posture of an institution that genuinely does not know and is opening the question to whoever wants to look. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard described today's release as the first in what will be an ongoing joint declassification and release effort. Ongoing. Joint. That means the FBI material and the Department of War material and the NASA material are going to continue to come out in additional tranches every few weeks as more documents are reviewed and cleared. The full scope of what the government holds is not visible yet. What is visible today is the opening of a door, not the contents of the room behind it. FBI Director Kash Patel said this morning that for the first time in history, the American people have unfettered access to declassified government files on unidentified anomalous phenomenon. Unfettered. No clearance required. No FOIA request. No waiting period. The files are on a government website, and anyone with an internet connection can download them. That is a genuine change. Whatever you think of the political context in which it happened, whatever your views on the administration that ordered it, or the officials who carried it out, the fact of public access to these documents is real and it is new. People who have spent decades trying to get this information through official channels, researchers, journalists, congressional staffers, have hit walls at every turn. Today those walls came down, at least partially, at least for the documents in this first release. And what those documents show, taken together, is a portrait of a government that has been accumulating anomalous observations for a very long time, logging them carefully, attempting to explain them, and in case after case, arriving at the same honest conclusion. We cannot determine what this was. That is the story behind the story, not the individual cases, compelling as they are. Not the Apollo 17 photograph, or the rotating object, or the infrared images from 2025. The story is the volume, the consistency, the geographic and temporal spread, the fact that across all of the variants in the cases, across all the different years and different sensors and different observers, the outcome is uniform. The government looked. The government could not determine what it saw. The government kept looking. The government still cannot determine what it sees. And today, for the first time, you can look too. The question is what you do with that. What any of this means. Not in the sense of what conclusions you draw about the nature of the phenomena, because that is a question the evidence does not currently support answering, but in a larger sense, what it means that the planet Earth contains observers who regularly encounter things in their sky that they cannot explain, that those observations get formally logged by the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus in human history, and that the apparatus, after decades of looking, comes back with the same answer every time. We don't know. There is something in that answer that is worth sitting with tonight. Not because it is frightening, not because it implies any particular conclusion about what is out there, but because it is honest, because it is the answer that follows from the evidence rather than from the desire to close the question, because it is the same answer that Ron Evans gave when he first looked out the window 3 hours after leaving Earth and tried to name what he was seeing. He did not know. He said so. And 53 years later, neither does anyone else. That is not a failure. That is where the inquiry is. That is the actual frontier, not the boundary between Earth and space, but the boundary between what we can explain and what we cannot. And the crew of Apollo 17, without planning to, without intending to, without even realizing in the moment that what they were reporting would still be unresolved when the next century arrived, went right up to that frontier and stood there and looked, and they told us what they saw. Gene Cernan was the last human being to walk on the moon. Not the last in the sense that he was the 12th of 12. The last in the sense that after he climbed the ladder of the Lunar Module Challenger at the end of the third and final moonwalk of Apollo 17, no human being has walked on the surface of another world since. That was December 14th, 1972. More than 50 years have passed. The footprints he left in the Taurus Littrow Valley are still there. There is no wind on the moon to disturb them, no rain, no erosion of any kind. The prints of his boots in the grey regolith are exactly where he left them, preserved in the airless cold, waiting for whoever comes next. Before he climbed the ladder for the last time, he stopped. He knew it was the last time, for him, and possibly for a very long time for anyone. He knelt down and traced his daughter, Tracy's initials in the lunar dust, with his gloved finger. TDC, Tracy Dawn Cernan. Then he stood up and spoke, not into the mission radio in the formal voice of a commander making a transmission, but quietly to himself, to the valley around him, to whatever was listening. He said he believed that humanity's challenge of tomorrow was reflected in its opportunity at the Taurus Littrow Valley. He said he was leaving as he had come, with the hope that this would be not the last step, but the penultimate one, that the footprints he was leaving would be followed by others. Then he climbed the ladder, and the hatch closed, and the moon has been empty of human presence ever since. Cernan spent the rest of his life talking about what going to the moon meant. He gave interviews. He wrote a memoir. He testified before Congress about the importance of human space exploration. He was not a man who kept his feelings about the mission to himself. But there is one thing he said in a 2013 interview that sits differently now that the documents released today are public. He was asked whether he believed in life beyond Earth, and he said yes. He said that he thought the universe was too vast and too complex for the answer to be no. He said that what he had seen from the surface of the moon, the Earth hanging in the black sky, small and perfect and alone, had changed the way he thought about what was possible. He said he did not have evidence. He said he was not making a claim. But he said the question felt different to him after he had stood somewhere else in the solar system and looked back. He died in January of 2017. He never saw the documents released today. He never knew that the transcript of his December 1972 conversations with Mission Control including the section where he told Houston that there is something out there and it's something physical in the distance, was being held in a classified file somewhere in the government's archives. He never knew that the photograph taken near the lunar surface during his mission was sitting in a folder marked confidential for decades after the automatic declassification date had passed. What he knew was what he saw. And what he saw, he reported. The report stayed classified until this morning. Cernan was 58 years old when he died in January of 2017. He had spent the 45 years between his last moonwalk and his death doing what people who have done something unrepeatable tend to do, which is trying to communicate what it meant to people who were not there. He gave speeches. He wrote the memoir. He testified before Senate committees and House subcommittees about the strategic importance of human space exploration. He sat for interviews with journalists and documentarians and students and anyone who asked. And the thing he came back to, over and over, in all of those contexts, was not the technology. It was not the mission profile or the geological results or the data returned by the scientific instrument module. It was the view, specifically, the view of the Earth from the surface of the Moon. He described it as the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he said that inadequately captured it. He described the Earth as a small blue marble against absolute black, fragile-looking, self-contained, with no visible borders or divisions, no indication from that distance that the people on it had organized themselves into competing nations, or that there was anything on its surface worth fighting over. He said looking at it from the Moon produced a clarity about what actually mattered that he had never been able to fully translate into words for anyone who had not been there. He also said something else in a 1999 interview that received less attention than it deserved at the time. He was asked whether the Apollo program had answered the most important questions or opened them. And he said open them. He said going to the Moon had not made the universe smaller or more comprehensible. It had made it larger. It had made the questions bigger. He said the further you get from Earth, the more you realize how much you do not know. The clock was already ticking on that realization. It just took 53 years and a government declassification program for the rest of us to catch up to where Cernan was in 1999. Ron Evans is the member of the Apollo 17 crew who receives the least attention in retrospect, and there is something quietly unfair about that. He was the one who stayed in orbit. He was the one who spent 75 hours alone in the Command Module America, while Cernan and Schmitt walked on the surface below him. He was the one who, on each orbit, lost radio contact with Earth for approximately 47 minutes as the Moon passed between his spacecraft and the planet he had come from. 47 minutes of silence, 3 times per orbit, for 3 days. Total radio silence from Earth for approximately 3.5 hours of each 24-hour period, in a spacecraft the size of a compact car, over a surface that no human being had ever been close enough to see in detail before the Apollo program. He called it the most alone he had ever been. He also said he had not been frightened. He said the silence was not threatening. It was just a fact, the way a lot of things about spaceflight were just facts that you accepted because the alternative was not going. And then he made the one observation that changed the whole record of his mission. He looked out the window 3 hours after leaving Earth and reported what he saw with the careful, honest language of a man who did not know what he was looking at and said so. That report, and everything that followed from it across the next several days of the mission, is what put the Apollo 17 transcript in the classified file in 1973, and Evans never knew. He died in 1990, 7 years before the internet made the declassification of government documents something an ordinary person could track. He never saw the Freedom of Information Act requests that would later try and fail to surface these materials. He never knew that the conversation he had with Mission Control about fragments drifting past his window was sitting in a government archive marked confidential. What he knew was what he saw, and what he saw, he reported accurately and honestly. That is what his record shows, and that record is now public. Jack Schmitt is still alive and has not been quiet about any of this. In the years since Apollo 17, he has been one of the most persistent voices in the scientific and political communities arguing for a return to the moon. He has testified before Congress about the scientific value of lunar resources, about the geological history encoded in the lunar regolith, about what continued human presence on the moon would make possible for our understanding of the early solar system. He has been direct and specific and relentless in making the case. He has also been direct about what the absence of return means. In a 2022 interview, he said that the 50-year gap between Apollo 17 and the next human lunar landing, whenever it comes, represents the largest self-inflicted wound in the history of scientific exploration. He did not hedge that. He did not qualify it. He said what he meant, which is that the decision to end the Apollo program was a decision that cost humanity a half-century of knowledge and capability that cannot be recovered by returning now, only built forward from. That is the standard Schmitt holds. Conservative interpretation first, but honest acknowledgement of what the data shows. And the data on the 50-year gap shows a cost that no amount of subsequent progress fully offsets. In the transcripts released today, Schmitt's voice carries that same quality: the precision, the refusal to claim more than the evidence supports, the willingness to offer a hypothesis clearly labeled as a hypothesis. And underneath all of it, the scientific discipline of a man who spent his career taking seriously the difference between what you observe and what you conclude. The real question isn't whether these men saw something that cannot be explained. The real question is what it means that the same government that sent them there spent 53 years holding their report in a classified file. That question does not have a clean answer. The documents do not provide one. What they provide is the record itself, the words as they were spoken, the observations as they were made, the honest uncertainty of 3 trained observers doing their jobs at the edge of human experience, and the institutional decision to classify that record and hold it for longer than most people alive today have been alive. Whatever the reason for that decision, the decision is now reversed. The record is public. And the record is worth reading not for what it proves, but for what it shows about the people who made it. 3 men who went further from home than almost anyone in history, who encountered things they could not fully explain, and who responded to those things the same way they responded to everything else on the mission, with precision, with honesty, and with the professional discipline to say clearly and without embarrassment when they did not know. That discipline is what makes the transcripts worth reading. Not the mystery, though the mystery is real. The discipline. The example of what it looks like to encounter something unknown and resist the pull toward false certainty in either direction. Evans did not know. He said so. Cernan was certain it was physical. He said so. Schmitt offered a hypothesis. He labeled it as a hypothesis. And the government looked at all of it across 53 years and arrived at the only answer the evidence actually supports: unresolved. Not because the answer is being withheld, not because something dramatic is being concealed, but because unresolved is what honest looks like when the data runs out before the question does. What endures from Apollo 17 is not the mystery. It is the standard of observation, of reporting, of intellectual honesty about the boundary between what you know and what you do not. The standard did not make the news in December of 1972. It was not what the cameras were pointed at, but it is what the transcripts show in every exchange, across every tape, from launch to splashdown. And that brings us to the question that this video promised to sit with. Not the question of what the crew saw, because that question may never be fully answered, but the larger question, the one that the existence of these documents raises simply by being what they are. Why does it matter that these cases are unresolved? Not in the sense of what the unresolved cases imply about the nature of the phenomena, in the sense of what it means to live in a world where the most sophisticated observation apparatus ever assembled, staffed by the most trained observers ever produced, continues to encounter things it cannot explain, and continues to log those encounters carefully, and continues to arrive at the same honest conclusion decade after decade. The answer is not dramatic. It does not require a particular belief about what is out there. It simply requires taking seriously the idea that the boundary of human knowledge is real, that it exists, that it is not simply a matter of having the right theory or the right instrument, but that there are things in the world and in the sky and in the universe that remain genuinely outside what we currently understand. That boundary is not a failure. It is where inquiry lives. Every scientific advance in history began at a boundary like that, at a place where the observation did not fit the model, where the data came back with a result that did not match the expectation, where someone honest enough to say, "I do not know what this is," wrote that down and put it in the record. Cernan put it in the record. Evans put it in the record. Schmitt put it in the record. The military pilots over the Middle East and the UAE and Greece and Africa and Japan put it in the record. The federal employees who watched something move through the sky over the western United States and described it carefully enough for a composite sketch put it in the record. The record now belongs to anyone who wants to read it. So what do you do with it? What do you do tonight, lying in the dark, with the thought of those three men in their spacecraft somewhere between the Earth and the Moon, reporting what they saw with the same precision they would have applied to anything else on the mission, treated with the same seriousness and the same careful language and the same honest uncertainty that defined everything else they did? You do not have to conclude anything. The evidence does not require a conclusion. The government itself, after 53 years and access to everything, has not reached a conclusion. The honest position is the one the crew modeled throughout the mission. Observe, describe, report, and hold the question open for as long as the question warrants holding. The question has been open for 53 years. It is still open tonight, and there is something almost peaceful in that. Once you sit with it long enough, not the absence of an answer, but the presence of a genuine question. The universe is large enough that genuine questions should not surprise us. It has surprised us before. It will surprise us again. The crew of Apollo 17 went further from home than almost anyone in the history of our species, and they came back with observations that the most thorough analysis available has not been able to fully account for. And that tells you something real about the size of what we do not know, about how much territory exists beyond the edge of the current map. The footprints in the Taurus-Littrow Valley are still there, preserved exactly as Cernan left them, in the grey dust, in the airless cold, in the silence that Evans knew from his orbital track, and that Schmitt knew from the surface, and that none of the rest of us have ever heard. The transcript is now public. The photograph is now public. The debriefing that was marked confidential and held for 53 years past its automatic declassification date is now public. Anyone can read it. Anyone can sit with the words the crew used, the careful hedged language of trained observers doing their job. And anyone can arrive at their own sense of what those words mean. What Gene Cernan meant when he said, "There is something out there." What Ron Evans meant when he said, "That's a wild guess," when he called his own best explanation speculative before he even offered it. What Jack Schmitt meant when he said we had light flashes just about continuously during the whole flight, when we were dark adapted. What the instruments meant when they found a background of ultraviolet light that the most conservative interpretation explained, and certain characteristics of the spectrum did not. What the government meant when it looked at all of that, 53 years of looking, and wrote one word: unresolved. The real question is not whether something was out there. The real question is what we do with the fact that the people who went to look could not tell us what it was. So let the room go quiet now. Let the questions settle. You do not need to answer them tonight. The crew of Apollo 17 did not answer them in December of 1972, and they did not answer them in January of 1973 in the debriefing rooms in Houston, and nobody answered them in the 53 years in between. The questions are patient. They have been waiting this long. They can wait a little longer. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let the spacecraft drift. Let the Earth get smaller behind you and the moon grow slowly ahead. Let the fragment field drift past the window, bright and tumbling and unnamed. Let the rotating object flash its two flash patterns somewhere out in the dark, bright and then dull, and then bright again, rhythmic and steady and unexplained. Let the questions go unanswered, just for tonight. There will be more documents. There will be more releases. There will be more cases, more observers, more careful reports from trained people, looking out windows at things they cannot name. The government said this morning that the releases will continue on a rolling basis every few weeks as more files are reviewed and cleared. There is more to come. There is always more to come. But that is for another night. Tonight, you have heard what 3 astronauts said to Mission Control in December of 1972, in their own words, from the primary source documents that were marked confidential and released to the public this morning. You have heard what they saw and how they described it, and how honest they were about what they did not know. You have heard the science behind the light flashes and the uncertainty behind the UV background result, and the careful official language of an institution that has spent 53 years with these files and still calls them unresolved. You have heard the whole story, as much of it as currently exists to tell, and now it is quiet. And the question is still open, and somewhere in the Taurus Littrow Valley on the surface of the moon, in the grey dust that no wind disturbs and no rain reaches, the initials TDC are still traced in the regolith in the shape of a gloved finger. And what endures from Apollo 17 is not the mystery. It is the standard of observation, of reporting, of intellectual honesty about the boundary between what you know and what you do not. It is still there this morning, in the words on those pages, in the careful hedged language of 3 men doing their jobs at the edge of everything. And the footprints are still there, exactly where he left them.